On the morning of November 29, 1970, a man took his two young daughters hiking into a valley outside Bergen, Norway. The area was called Isdalen, Ice Valley. Locals had another name for it too, Death Valley. Not because of anything supernatural, just a long, quiet history of accidents, and before that, a history of people who went there and didn't come back on purpose. The family climbed a muddy trail above a lake ringed by pine trees. It was cold, the kind of cold that gets into your chest, and somewhere along that trail, one of the girls smelled something wrong. Not wood smoke, something heavier. She stepped off the path to look, and what she found would become one of the strangest unsolved deaths in modern European history. A case that, more than 50 years later, still doesn't have an ending. This is the story of the Isdal Woman. We're going to walk through this one carefully, because almost nothing about it is simple. Not her identity. Not her death. Not even the official explanation the police eventually settled on. An explanation that some of the investigators who worked the case never actually believed. Let's start at the beginning. Or at least, the beginning as far as anyone can prove. Bergen police arrived at the scene within the hour. What they found was the body of a woman, lying among the rocks in an unusual position, as though she had fallen backward down the slope. She was burned, extensively, and had been for some time before the family found her. The fire that caused it had gone out long before anyone arrived. Investigators searched the immediate area and found something strange laid out around the body. Jewelry, several bottles with their labels scraped off, a watch, an umbrella, the remnants of nylon stockings and a pair of rubber boots. One officer would later tell the BBC that the placement of these objects didn't look accidental. It looked deliberate. Almost ceremonial, he said, though he never explained exactly what he meant by that. The woman appeared to be somewhere between 25 and 40 years old, about 5'4", long dark hair, what remained of it. And here's the first real anomaly in this case, dental work. 14 fillings, several gold crowns. That kind of extensive, expensive dental care was almost unheard of in Norway at the time. It suggested she'd grown up somewhere else. Somewhere with very different standards of medicine and very different money behind it. But her face had been too damaged to identify from a photograph. So the police did the only thing they could. They built a description, and they started asking questions across the country. That's when this case stopped being simple, because almost immediately, hotel staff across Norway began calling in. And what they described wasn't just a woman who matched the sketch. It was a woman who had stayed in their hotels, under names that didn't match each other, connected to addresses that didn't exist. Investigators eventually traced a pattern going back to March of 1970, 8 months before her death. She had stayed at the Viking Hotel in Oslo under the name Genevieve Lancier, supposedly from the Belgian city of Louvain. A few days later, she checked into the Hotel Bristol in Bergen as Claudia Tielt of Brussels. Then the Hotel Scandia, same city, same alias. Then she disappeared from hotel records for months. In late October, she resurfaced in Stavanger under yet another name, Claudia Nielsen, this time claiming to be from Ghent. Days after that, back in Bergen, she checked in as Alexia Zarn Merchez, supposedly from Ljubljana. 7 names, 7 backstories, all of them false as far as anyone could ever determine. Now stop and think about what that actually takes. Not just picking a fake name at a front desk. She would have needed identification to match. Passports, in an era when hotels in Europe routinely recorded and checked them. Consistent cover stories she could recite without contradicting herself, city after city, month after month, and she never slipped. Not once, according to every hotel employee who spoke to police. Staff remembered her as fashionable, quiet, serious. She spoke poor English but fluent German and Flemish. One waitress recalled seeing her dine beside 2 men from the German Navy, including an officer, at a restaurant near the base in Bergen. And there was one more detail that nearly every witness brought up independently, without being asked. She smelled faintly, persistently of garlic. It's a strange thing to fixate on, but when investigators cross-referenced the timeline, the pattern held. Different city, different name, different alibi, same scent every time. Here's where the case escalates. Because a woman going to this much trouble to stay anonymous should have been very hard to find. She wasn't invisible. People noticed her. They just couldn't place her. A local hiker later came forward and said that 5 days before the body was discovered, he'd seen a woman on a nearby hillside who fit the description almost exactly. She was dressed lightly, more suited for the city than for a hike. She was walking ahead of two men in coats, who, in his words, looked Southern European. She appeared to be about to say something to him. She didn't. He mentioned it to an acquaintance on the police force at the time, and was told, essentially, to let it go. It wasn't logged as evidence for years. That's not the only place this case runs into a wall of official disinterest. It happens again and again. Tips dismissed, reports filed late or not at all. People discouraged from pursuing leads that seemed at the time too strange to be worth the department's resources. We'll come back to why that might be. For now, let's get to the scene itself, because the physical evidence only deepens the mystery. 3 days after the body was found, police located 2 suitcases at the Bergen train station, checked in a locker. Fingerprints on a pair of glasses inside matched the body. The suitcases held wigs, currency from several different countries, a tube of eczema cream, makeup, its labels carefully removed, just like nearly everything else she'd owned, and a notepad filled with handwriting that at first glance looked like nonsense, a code. It would take investigators considerable time to work out what any of it meant, and even now, not every entry has been fully explained. Detectives traced one item from the suitcase, a pair of shoes, to a shop over 100 miles away. The clerk remembered selling them. He remembered the woman clearly, well-dressed, calm, insistent on that exact pair, and he remembered the garlic smell too. The autopsy findings were their own puzzle. Cause of death was determined to be a combination of sleeping pill overdose and carbon monoxide exposure, likely from a fire near where she was found. Her stomach contained residue from more than 40 tablets of a sedative called phenymal. The same type of pills were recovered near her body. Her lungs showed soot, which told examiners something important. She had still been breathing when the burning began. There was also bruising on her neck, the kind that could be explained by a fall, or by something else entirely. And underneath her body, investigators found a fur hat, a style common in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, Soviet territory at the time. It had no label. Nothing about it or her matched anything Norwegian. By late December of 1970, less than a month after the body was found, Bergen police held a press conference. Their conclusion: the woman had most likely died by suicide, setting the fire herself. The case was formally closed in early 1971. She was buried in a Bergen cemetery under Catholic rites, based on the assumption that the saints' names she'd used as aliases suggested a Catholic background. It was, in the end, a guess layered on top of other guesses. She was placed in a zinc coffin, specifically chosen so her remains could be preserved and later re-examined if anyone ever came forward to claim her. The only people at the funeral were police. Nobody ever did come forward, not for 50 years. Now here's the part of this story that turns a strange death into a genuine mystery. Decades later, several of the original investigators admitted, on the record, that they never actually believed the suicide ruling. Not fully, not even at the time. Think about what the official explanation requires you to accept. That a woman meticulous enough to erase every label from her belongings, sophisticated enough to maintain 7 consistent false identities across multiple cities for 8 months without a single documented slip, chose to end her life in a remote valley outside Bergen. After apparently taking dozens of sleeping pills, which alone would likely have been fatal on their own, and after somehow also being burned badly enough to leave soot in her lungs, meaning she was still alive when the fire reached her. A Swiss forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the case files decades later put it plainly. Suicide, in his assessment, was very unlikely. Too much of the evidence pointed toward the involvement of another person. So if it wasn't suicide, what was it? This is where the case takes its most contested turn, and it's worth walking through carefully, because there are 2 competing threads here, and neither one has ever been proven. First is Cold War espionage. In 1970, Bergen was home to Norway's largest naval base. At the exact time the Isdal Woman was moving through the city under false names, that base was testing a new missile system. Norwegian intelligence sources later confirmed that foreign agents were known to be operating in the area, monitoring exactly that kind of activity. A woman with no verifiable identity, fluent in multiple languages, moving in and out of hotels near military installations, meeting foreign naval officers, carrying disguises and unlabeled belongings. On paper, it reads like a spy novel. But investigators who've studied the case closely point out the details don't fully add up to classic espionage tradecraft either. Professional intelligence agencies typically equip their operatives with a single reliable false identity, not a rotating cast of 7. Career spies tend to stay in one place long enough to build local contacts, not crisscross an entire country changing names every few days. If anything, her behavior looks less like trained fieldwork and more like something more chaotic, more personal, which brings us to the second thread. In 2019, following a newspaper article in France, a man from the town of Forbach came forward with a very different account. He said he'd had a brief relationship with a woman matching her description in the summer of 1970. He described her as multilingual, with what he believed was a Balkan accent. He said she took frequent, unexplained phone calls from abroad, and that he once searched through her belongings and found wigs and disguises. He suspected, even then, that she was hiding something. He kept a photograph of her on horseback, which surfaced decades later as one of the only images anyone has ever produced that might show her alive. If his account is accurate, it complicates the espionage theory without eliminating it. It's entirely possible for someone to be both. A person living a double life for reasons that were personal, financial, or professional, using the skills of deception without ever formally working for a state intelligence service. There's a darker theory too, one that's gained traction among researchers who've spent years on the case, that the Isdal Woman may have been working in a trade that required exactly the kind of anonymity she practiced. One where a rotating identity protects both the person and their clients, where unmarked luggage and untraceable movement are simply the cost of doing business. Under this theory, her death wasn't political at all. It was personal. Someone she met during her travels, someone who was never identified, may have been present when she died, whether by her own hand or not. None of these theories close the loop. That's the frustrating, honest truth of this case. Every lead runs for a while and then simply stops. In 2016, 45 years after her burial, Norwegian broadcaster NRK reopened the investigation, working alongside Bergen Police and BBC World Service. They commissioned new forensic sketches. They ran isotope analysis on her teeth, a technique that didn't exist in 1970, capable of estimating where a person spent their childhood based on chemical signatures left behind in tooth enamel. The results narrowed her likely origin to the border regions between France, Germany, Luxembourg, and Belgium. It also revised her estimated age upward, closer to 40 than 30 at the time of her death. They exhumed the organ tissue samples that had been preserved at a Bergen hospital since the original autopsy and submitted them for DNA testing, hoping for a match in international databases. There was no match. There still isn't one. More than 150 tips came in after the documentary aired. Most led nowhere. A handful, like the man from Forbach, added detail without adding resolution. And in 2023, a Swiss newspaper published new research pointing toward a possible connection to a wealthy Swiss banker with alleged ties to post-war financial networks. Another thread that widened the mystery rather than solving it. So where does that leave us, more than 50 years later? We know what she wanted people to believe about her, 7 times over, and none of it was true. We know what her body could tell forensic scientists, and what it couldn't. We know that the people closest to this case, the ones who stood over her in that valley in 1970, walked away convinced that the official answer wasn't the real one, and said nothing publicly for decades. We don't know her name. We don't know where she was born, though science has narrowed it to a region spanning 4 countries. We don't know if she died by her own hand or someone else's. We don't know why a woman that careful, that deliberate, that practiced at disappearing would choose to die somewhere she could be found at all. She remains in that zinc coffin in Bergen, in a grave that was always meant to be temporary, waiting for someone to come and finally say her name. If you were investigating this case with everything we've just laid out, what's your theory? Was she a spy caught between Cold War powers? A woman hiding from a life she'd built out of necessity? Or something else entirely? Something none of the last 50 years of investigation has even considered? Whatever you believe, one thing is certain. Somewhere, someone knows who she was, and after half a century, that person has stayed silent longer than almost anyone else in this story.